Hey YouTube, what's up? Today we're going to talk about the female hormonal axis, and I think I got some pretty good mnemonics for you guys today, and so it should be pretty easy to remember this stuff once we're done here, if you'll just give me a chance to get through this. So one thing is hopefully you've already watched my male hormonal axis video, because there's so many analogies between the male hormonal system and the female hormonal system. You know, people may try and pretend that's not the case. First major analogy is going to be that luteinizing hormone in the testicles, remember, stimulate Leydig cells to produce testosterone. We have a similar situation where we have luteinizing hormone stimulating in the ovary, in these TECA cells, and these TECA cells produce testosterone. So one quick thing is you can remember for the female, TECA cells produce testosterone because they both start with a T. But the steps don't really end there, nor do they really end there in the male. But what I'm going to say here is for the female, the testosterone then diffuses to the granulosa cell, and the granulosa cell, through the action of aromatase, is able to convert the testosterone into 17-beta estradiol. So in both cases, luteinizing hormone has some effect on the physiology, and that effect specifically is that luteinizing hormone stimulates desmolase, and the enzyme is the enzyme that introduces cholesterol into the steroid pathways. So it takes cholesterol and forms this important hormone, pregnenolone, and that's true for both the male and the female. And this is just, of course, shorthand for the fact that you start with cholesterol and kind of the end product is testosterone, but as you probably know, there's also DHT, which is after testosterone. Similar case, testosterone is further derived in the female, as I say, to estradiol. One other thing I might mention right now is that pregnenolone can not only be further synthesized towards estradiol, but it is also the major precursor of progesterone, which we'll talk about in a second. But remembering this little order can be a little difficult, so let's just look at this mnemonic I got. So luteinizing hormone, the word lutein is basically in Latin or Greek, I can't remember which, means yellow. So let that remind you of a sort of yellow beverage like beer. Now the beer is delivered to the discoteca, which is this is a beach discoteca for the analogy here. And at the discoteca, this nice discoteca bartender serves Tommy testosterone here. And Tommy testosterone diffuses out onto the beach, where he finds his girl. She's sitting on these sand granules, grains of sand, and so we'll call this the granulosa girl. And at the granulosa cell, as I said, excuse me, you have testosterone further synthesized into 17-beta estradiol. So just think of Tommy giving this sand-loving 17-year-old another drink, and so she is a diol. You can remember she's a diol. And that may or may not be important for you to remember. We'll talk about the trial estrogen in a bit. So specifically, remember, luteinizing hormone stimulates desmolase. So this bartender is representing desmolase, and you can remember that I have drawn on him some moles. They're a little bit small. Maybe you can't see them, but I have some moles drawn on him. But here's another basic breakdown of this desmolase enzyme. So here we have this dude, he's representing this maybe desmolase guy on his day off, and he's serving his pregnant wife some cholesterol-rich eggs. So that reminds you that desmolase converts cholesterol represented by the eggs, into pregnenolone, which, as I said before, is further synthesized into progesterone. So luteinizing hormone stimulates TECA cells. TECA cells produce testosterone. Testosterone diffuses to granulosa cells, which produce estradiol, 17-beta estradiol. Furthermore, I have this one little bubble before we move on, where she says, "Tommy, where are my fish sticks? Where is my fish?" Because FSH is the other major hormone stimulating this pathway, and FSH is stimulating aromatase in granulation or granulosa cells to make this conversion to estradiol. So that's that. We'll talk about that again in a second. If that's not 100% for you. So here you've seen these cycles before. I'm sure this is the hormonal cycle through a month for the female hormonal axis. So up here we have luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Their basic trajectory is the same. They are, for the most part, maintained at constant levels through the cycle, and then they spike at the ovulation, and then proceed back down to their approximately steady state. Then we have estrogen and progesterone, where we have estrogen having an early peak in the follicular stage. So in between these lines we have the follicular stage, and here we have the luteal stage. And then lastly, progesterone having mostly just this peak in the this luteal period. So what I've done here is I've added these little photos on here to remind you of basically what hormones peak where. So monthly progesterone follows the topography of a gestating female. So this curve here can remind you of the curve of a pregnant stomach. So yeah, I got this picture here, and that should basically remind you. So progesterone, obviously the word progesterone means pro-gestation, and that gestation word should remind you of this bump right here in the luteal phase. We'll talk about progesterone more here in a sec. Estrogen, on the other hand, follows the curve of an estrogen developed breasts of a woman, followed by a estrogen maintained pregnancy. So one thing to point out, to be clear on, is that obviously this is the monthly cycle. This is the non-pregnant cycle of a woman, but I'm just using these as kind of mnemonics in order to, because I mean look at them. This looks like it looks like a woman laying on her side. How can you resist that mnemonic? So the breasts of the woman representing the early estrogen peak in the follicular phase, and the second peak in the luteal phase representing the peak of the luteal phase. And that, of course, can just remind you of two functions of estrogen: the development of the breasts. This is, of course, during pregnancy, not during this cycle, like I'm telling you. And then maintaining pregnancy also. There's some other functions we're going to talk about here in a second. One other cute little fact to point out is that the phase describes the major source of estrogen during that phase. So during the follicular phase, estrogen is produced by the follicle. During the luteal phase, the estrogen is produced by the corpus luteum. So that could be maybe a test question or something. Of course, since this is the luteal phase, the progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum. Lastly, we have the LH and FSH curve. I want to point out is shaped basically like a needle. It's a giant peak here, so-called luteal surging. And so this needle shape can remind you of the popping of the the figurative popping, at least, of the ovarian follicle caused by the luteal surge. And this, of course, marks the end of the follicular phase and the beginning of the luteal phase. So it's kind of interesting to note that this surge occurs when estrogen themselves surge, so that this shape of the breast back here reminds you of that estrogen surge, basically leading to this luteal surge. So basically what happens is estrogen levels become so high that the negative feedback, the normal negative feedback due to estrogen, becomes a positive feedback. And so it causes this luteal hormone and FSH to briefly surge. But it's kind of interesting to know also that how can the estrogens cause a surge if steroidogenesis itself is under control of FSH and LH? So remember, that was just this stuff we were talking about, where LH affects the TECA cell and FSH affects the granulosa cell. So how it works is estrogen actually upregulates LH, progesterone, and receptors for itself. So in that way, it can effectively, as it surges itself, produce a surge in this other hormone that is in fact regulating it. So briefly, just as review, what's another hormone that does this? I talked about in my testosterone or my male hormonal axis video that gonadotrophin releasing hormone also does this, and ACTH also does this. That's kind of interesting. So back to desmolase. So remember, desmolase was this moly bartender back in the TECA cells who also who notably actually, let's say, converts cholesterol into pregnenolone, because we remember this moly guy serving his pregnant wife cholesterol eggs. One other thing is, with respect to desmolase, is that ACTH also stimulates desmolase, and ketoconazole inhibits desmolase. So those are important factoids. It's also important to note the other major enzyme in the female steroid pathway that I already mentioned, just to make it a little more concrete, is the granulosa. Let's say the granule-loving beach girl sensed that smell of fish sticks and was stimulating her aroma center as she sat on the beach. And so FSH stimulates aromatase, which converts testosterone into 17-beta estradiol, basically. So, similar to how the major product of the male hormonal axis, being testosterone, produced negative feedback, logically there's a similar situation in the female, where the major product of their hormonal axis, sexual hormones that is, produce a negative feedback on FSH and LH. And that's basically one other thing that I was basically discussing up here, where estrogen normally has this negative feedback effect, except during the luteal surge. So many people, when they're talking about female hormones, they begin with a brief joke about how complicated females are and how simple guys are. One thing that might add to this idea that female hormones are so complicated is, I think, the fact that estradiol can have this positive or negative effect on FSH and LH. Whereas testosterone was, it doesn't switch between the two, so it just seems so much simpler. So in normal situation, we have estradiol having a negative control on FSH and LH, just like other hormones in the pituitary axis. The major products usually come back and inhibit either the pituitary or the hypothalamus. Or, as we mentioned already, the estradiol during the luteal surge switches, and it has a stimulatory effect on FSH and LH, in fact, causing the surge. That is related to estradiol's ability to upregulate um, receptors. Rather curious effect, in fact. Progesterone, on the other hand, always inhibits FSH and LH. And so progesterone is only high during the luteal phase, as we remember from this little mnemonic. So originally, estrogen begins with these lower levels inhibiting the FSH and LH, and then over here, both of these hormones teaming up to inhibit FSH and LH. The fact that FSH and LH are held in check except during ovulation indicates their function and their names. So, follicle stimulating hormone, of course, stimulates the follicle. Luteinizing hormone obviously causes luteinization. And the fact that they are surging during ovulation, as I mentioned, indicates that they are important for ovulation, and they are. So, although estradiol and progesterone both promote breast development and maintain pregnancy, progesterone really earns its name because it lowers the threshold for contractile stimuli, whereas estrogen does the opposite. So progesterone is for gestation, it's progestation, that's why it's called progesterone, and so it tries to maintain pregnancy by lowering contractile stimuli. However, it's interesting to note that we'll talk about that in a second. Progesterone and estrogen raise basal body temperature. So if you remember back from this mnemonic, if you can remember that, then you can remember that during this phase where both of these are raised, there's going to be a raise in basal body temperature. So if someone asks you a test question, in which phase of the female cycle is the basal body temperature higher? Well, you remember that progesterone and estrogen together cause a raised temperature. It has to be in this phase where progesterone is higher, and this gestation curve, by our analogy, will remind you of progesterone being high in this luteal phase. So the answer would be luteal phase. Fertilization results in human chorionic gonadotrophin. So as the name suggests, it is a human chorionic product, and it causes gonadotrophin. Remember, the word trophin means turning, so it basically tells the gonad to turn up and keep up the estrogen and progesterone levels. So many people know that human chorionic gonadotropin are the basis of many a pregnancy test, and so for this reason, pregnancy tests are going to be most accurate when this human chorionic gonadotropin is at its peak. So while it's maintaining that message. So when does it peak? Human chorionic gonadotropin peaks in week 9, and so I have this little mnemonic where we say human chorionic gonadotrophin peaks at week 9. Too far outside this range, and the test may say 9 when it should say ja. So using the German words 9 and ja. So a pregnancy test basically tells you yes or no, 9 oder ja, 9 or ja, or yes, no or yes, to that pregnancy. Are you pregnant or not? And it basically works on best basically on week 9, because that's when the chorionic gonadotrophin hormone is basically at its peak. So progesterone and estrogen are normally products of the ovaries, except during a special time in a woman's life. So, and if a woman doesn't get pregnant, then basically her whole life is spent with estrogen and progesterone being produced from the ovaries. But like I say, there's this little special time when during the second and third trimesters of pregnancy, I have a typo, I have a couple typos in this, so forgive me there, where progesterone is and estrogen are formed basically from the placenta. So progesterone essentially is from the placenta, and then we have this sort of more complex relationship where estrogen is kind of interacting with the fetal adrenals and the fetal liver in order to get that estrogen formed. Ultimately, there's an aromatization step in the placenta where that is finally formed, and estriol is the product. And so you can remember it's estriol because the baby tries all the trimesters. So hopefully, at least hopefully, they try all the trimesters. But I mean, just briefly, there's fetal adrenals, as I mentioned, are gonna take off this sulfur group, and then there's gonna be the aromatization step in the placenta, as I mentioned. I'm not sure how important those details are for you. Maybe you could just basically remember that the adrenals and the liver, both important sites for steroid hormones in general, or because obviously the liver has a close tie to the cholesterol system. So just remember the fetal adrenals and liver interact with that. Basically, it's probably what you want to remember. All right, last little page here, parturition. No one really knows what causes this process to begin, rather complicated and mysterious. But what is known is that the ratio of estrogen to progesterone increases towards parturition, and what that does is it makes the uterus more sensitive to contraction stimuli, the most notable being oxytocin. So we already mentioned this as I remember. So what I told you was estrogen increases the contractile the sensitivity to contractile stimuli, and progesterone wants to maintain gestation, is what I told you. It's progestation, and so it tries to basically extend that gestation by reducing the sensitivity to contractile stimuli such as oxytocin. All right, lastly, we have lactation. So through the pregnancy, human placental lactogen is secreted, and then we also have prolactin being produced through estrogen, and that those levels of obviously also rise during pregnancy, and they cause development of the lactating system for the female. But there's this interesting sort of negative feedback relationship I'm going to mention real quick. So while estrogen and prolactin levels block production of milk at the let me see. So increasing levels of human placental lactogen increase during pregnancy, and estrogen-induced placental rise during pregnancy. Yet high estrogen and prolactin, there's another typo, levels block production of milk at the level of the breast. So high estrogen and high prolactin levels, which occur during pregnancy, in fact keep milk production from happening. Whereas after birth, prolactin levels block the female gonadal hormonal axis at the hypothalamic, pituitary, and ovarian levels. So an all-out block of prolactin once the estrogen levels go down. So if that's not clear to you, let me say it one more time. Estrogen levels with high prolactin levels have a blocking effect of the production of milk at the level of the breast, whereas once estrogen levels are down, prolactin itself actually blocks the whole female gonadal hormonal axis at all those levels. And so what we can say, since suckling basically releases prolactin, suckling is an effective ovulation suppressor. And so the female can remain in a state of suppressed ovulation indefinitely as long as suckling occurs and prolactin production occurs. I guess that's all I have for you. Let me briefly summarize maybe. So we had this sort of hormonal axis at the level of the um, follicle in the ovary. We had these important sort of relationships of these hormones throughout the hormonal cycle. We had a bunch of tidbits here, and then we had a little discussion on parturition and lactation. I hope this was basically helpful for you guys. Good luck studying, and thanks for watching. Please like the video if you got anything out of this, and cheers. Have a good day.